Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're neutrally exploring the classical Islamic philosophy of state and authority. But we're not going to be looking at this through the typical lens of historical events or specific rulers. Instead, we're taking a purely architectural and structural approach. We want to understand exactly how classical scholars conceptualize the nuts and bolts, the actual mechanics of a functioning society. So let's dive right in. Now, according to this classical framework, before we even start talking about laws or societal structures, we have to ask ourselves a pretty fundamental question. What is the true purpose of a state? Like, is governance just an end in itself? Is the whole point simply to grab power and manage a piece of land? Or is the state actually just a mechanism, a structural tool, if you will, built to serve a much higher purpose? That brings us to Section 1, the blueprint. We're looking at governance as a means to an end. Just look at how clearly this defines the core philosophy. In classical Islamic thought, the state and the authority it holds are absolutely, unequivocally not ends in themselves. They are strictly a means to an end. And what is that end? To establish justice. Governance literally only exists as a structural tool to create a balanced, just environment where people can freely worship, fulfill their duties to society, and stay away from what's prohibited. It's a purely functional tool, not some ultimate prize to be won.
And this deeply structural view goes right back to the foundational scriptures. This verse from the Quran points out that divine messengers were sent specifically to equip humanity with tools, namely the scripture and the balance, to maintain fairness. The focus here is entirely on the system itself. It's about the tools provided to humanity to keep society just, rather than focusing on the personal power or prestige of whoever happens to be in charge.
Moving on to Section 2, the foundation, specifically the concept of mizan.
To really understand how this justice works, we have to look at mizan. The scholar Ibn Ashur defines mizan, which translates to balance, as a strict, incredibly equitable distribution of rights. It acts as the very bedrock of a functioning society. Picture a literal, physical scale in your mind. How do you keep it perfectly balanced? Well, you have to constantly ascertain the equivalence between two distinct parties. It's a highly systemic, calculated view of justice. It requires this constant calibration and measurement of rights within the society so that nothing tips over into oppression. Which brings us to the absolute bottom line. According to the jurisprudence explored by writers like Aisha Bavili, enabling individuals to safely practice their faith and fulfill their obligations to the broader society is the core function of any legitimate government. In fact, it's the sole purpose of the state, period. If the state isn't providing that basic structural baseline, then it's completely failing its foundational design. So you might be wondering, what actually happens when a society pulls this off and achieves this balance? Well, the classical scholar al-Mawardi outlined that comprehensive justice structurally produces some incredible societal benefits. It naturally generates social harmony, which then paves the way for serious nation building and economic prosperity. It even creates the right conditions for population increase, and crucially, it guarantees the safety of the ruler. There's actually a famous classical story about a foreign general who's shocked to find a leader sleeping soundly outside without any guards, simply because that leader had established perfect justice. The justice itself was his structural security system. No guards needed. But let's look at the flip side. When that foundation of justice cracks, the entire structural integrity of the nation is doomed. The sources are super clear on this. Injustice destroys a nation faster than literally anything else. Why? Because it sets off this compounding, runaway pattern of corruption. Once the system of balance is broken, there are no limits to the decay. It just engulfs everything, completely eroding the societal structure from the inside out until it collapses.
All right, Section 3, the pillars. This is where religion and authority come into play. Now, obviously, justice can't just uphold itself in a vacuum, right? It needs physical, structural pillars to support it. Imam al-Ghazali famously described religion, or deen, and authority, or sultan, as inseparable twins. They absolutely must operate together. Think of it like this. You have the moral, legislative framework on one side, and the executive, administrative power on the other. They are two solid pillars holding up the exact same roof.
So the really crucial question is, what happens if you try to split them up? Ibn Taymiyyah points out that separating these two pillars totally removes the mechanism needed to properly dispense wealth and build prosperity. If you have authority without a moral framework, you just get tyranny. And if you have a moral framework but zero authority to actually enforce it, you get chaos. Divorcing these two pillars leads to systemic ruin. As he put it, the affairs of the people are completely spoiled.
Okay, so where do the people fit into this grand architecture? While executive authority is definitely necessary, the collective body of the people, the ummah, acts as the ultimate safeguard for this divine law. It's brilliant, really. The system doesn't just rely on the rulers, it structurally embeds the general public as the protectors of the entire framework. The people are literally the quality control mechanism, holding the authority accountable to the law.
And that leads us perfectly into the concept of sovereignty. Ultimately, in this framework, it is the law itself, the Sharia, that holds supreme sovereignty. The law sets the exact, hard limits of authority. So authority is entirely a delegated power. Yes, the system mandates obedience to those in command, but only because the overarching law has delegated that specific, highly limited power to them. The ruler is subject to the blueprint, completely bound by it, not the author of it. Finally, Section 4, the architecture of governance. Let's look at the famous tent analogy.
To really visualize how all these abstract concepts interlock, it's fascinating to see how Kabul al-Ba conceptualized the state as a physical tent. In this model, Islam, representing the overarching sovereignty and law, is the tent itself, providing the sheltering canopy for society. The ruler, the authority, is simply the central load-bearing pole holding that canopy up in the air. And the people? The people are the pegs, driven firmly into the ground, pulling the ropes taut and keeping the whole structure stable and secure.
As Kabul al-Ahbar perfectly summarized it, each is useful only with the others. It's the ultimate example of structural interdependence. Think about it. A tent canopy without a pole just collapses into a pile of fabric on the ground. A pole without a canopy is literally just a stick in the dirt. And without the pegs, the people, providing that necessary tension and safeguard, a strong wind is going to blow the entire structure away. Sovereignty, leadership, and the public are entirely structurally reliant on one another to keep the whole thing standing.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. Look at this ancient, deeply interdependent architecture of state, authority, and the public. How does this structural blueprint, where power is just a means to an end, strictly constrained by a higher law, and completely dependent on the tension provided by the people, compare to the political systems and structural frameworks we see operating in our world today? It's a pretty fascinating lens through which to view how we build our societies, isn't it? Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the blueprints around you.